The biting winter wind whipped through the narrow street, carrying flurries of snow that clung to my Lynn's tattered shawl. Christmas was only a few weeks away, but the festive cheer felt like a cruel joke. Her hands, numb with cold, trembled as she recounted the coins for the 5th time. 7 cents. It was all that separated her 4-year-old daughter, and from the starvation that was already claiming her. The little girl lay limp in her arms, a feather lightweight against her own hollow-out frame. 5 days without food had stolen the life from Amai's cheeks and the strength from her body. The crying had stopped yesterday, a silence that terrified my Lynn more than any scream. She pressed her face against the frosted glass of Gable's general store, watching families inside purchase flour and salted pork, their movements easy and unburdened. Her breath fogged the window, a fleeting warmth against the cold. A prayer, worn thin from constant repetition since her husband's death in the mine collapse 3 months prior, escaped her lips. "Please, just help me feed my baby." The mining company had evicted them the day after the funeral, declaring the shack was for working families. As if my Lynn hadn't scrubbed floors and mended clothes for others until her fingers bled, trying to earn enough to survive. Her worn-out boots did little to protect her feet from the snow-covered ground. She had sold everything of value, her wedding ring, a small jade pendant from her mother, even her winter coat. The 7 cents were the last remnants of a life that had crumbled to dust. Amai stirred, her small lips parting, searching for nourishment that wasn't there. Each shallow breath was a fresh crack in my Lynn's breaking heart. The bell above the store door chimed. Gathering her last ounce of courage, my Lynn pushed inside. The warmth hit her like a physical blow, and she swayed, nearly collapsing from the sudden relief. Mrs. Gable, the owner's wife, looked up from her ledger, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as the winter outside. "We don't give charity here," she said before my Lynn could utter a word. "Hard work is what builds character, not handouts." The whispers of the other customers, well-fed and warmly dressed, cut through the air. They stared at the Chinese widow and her pale child, their judgment a palpable force. "Please," my Lynn's voice was barely a whisper. "My little girl, she hasn't eaten in 5 days. I have 7 cents. Perhaps some old bread." Her words trailed off as Mrs. Gable's expression hardened. "I'll work for it," my Lynn pleaded, holding Amai tighter. "I can clean, so, anything you need." Mrs. Gable shook her head. "I won't enable laziness. There's always work for those willing to find it." The lie stung. No one in this town wanted to hire a desperate Chinese woman with a sick child in tow. The store's bell chimed again, and a sudden silence fell over the room. A massive shadow fell across the doorway as a man stepped inside. He was immense, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire frame. His hands were weathered and calloused, yet he moved with a surprising gentleness. Deep lines etched a face that had seen years of harsh sun and harsher winters, and his grey eyes held a quiet strength that commanded respect. Sheriff Brody, who had been leaning against the counter, immediately straightened. "Afternoon, Corrigan," he said, a note of deference in his voice. The giant, Corrigan, gave a curt nod. His gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with those storm-grey eyes that missed nothing. When his attention settled on my Lynn and the listless child in her arms, his expression shifted. The hard lines around his eyes softened, and he swallowed hard as he looked at Amai's pale, still form. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by an audience, found her voice. "Now, don't you go feeling sorry for her, Arthur. Some people create their own problems." But Arthur Corrigan's eyes never left Amai's face. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat, addressing my Lynn with a false authority. "A child needs proper care. If you can't provide it..." He let the threat of the poorhouse, a place from which children rarely returned, hang in the air. "Please," my Lynn whispered, her voice breaking. "She's all I have left." Amai's breathing grew even more shallow, and panic rose in my Lynn's chest like a flood. That's when Arthur Corrigan stepped forward. His heavy winter boots struck the wooden floor with purpose. He stopped directly in front of Mrs. Gable, his presence dominating the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, like thunder rolling across distant mountains. How much for everything she needs? Mrs. Gable blinked. What? Food. Milk. Medicine. Blankets, he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Whatever it takes. How much? The store owner stammered, caught completely off guard, as Arthur's gaze fixed once more on Mai's face. For just a moment, a flicker of profound, unbearable loss crossed his features before he mastered it, his jaw set like granite. Without another word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thick leather wallet. Everything, he repeated, his deep voice filling the quiet store as he laid a sum of money on the counter that made Mai Lin gasp. Milk, bread, medicine for the fever, a warm blanket. Whatever a child needs. He counted out the bills, far more than necessary. And don't you dare shortchange her. Mrs. Gable's face flushed with indignation, but she didn't argue. No one argued with Arthur Corrigan. As the woman who had just refused her 7-cent scrambled to fill a basket, Mai Lin held Mai closer, afraid to believe this was real. Men didn't help strangers, especially not women like her, without expecting something in return. Come, Arthur said quietly to Mai Lin, picking up the heavy basket as if it weighed nothing. Your daughter needs to eat. He led her outside into the swirling snow, the judgmental stares of the townspeople following them. He helped her onto the seat of a large wagon hitched to 2 strong horses, his touch careful and respectful. Once she was settled, he pulled a small bottle of milk from the basket. Try to get her to drink, he said softly. Just a little. Mai Lin's hand shook as she brought the bottle to Mai's lips. For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then, a deep instinct seemed to awaken, and her daughter's mouth moved weakly, taking a few precious sips before exhaustion claimed her again. But it was enough. It was life. Thank you, Mai Lin whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Arthur climbed into the driver's seat but didn't take the reins. He studied her with those storm-grey eyes. My name is Arthur Corrigan. I own a ranch about 10 miles from here. It's a quiet, safe place. I am Mai Lin, and this is Mai, she replied, still clutching the bottle of milk like a holy relic. We are grateful, Mr. Corrigan. Mrs. Lin, he said carefully, when was the last time your daughter had a proper meal or slept in a warm bed? The question was a gentle observation, not an accusation, but it cut straight to her heart. 3 months ago, she answered honestly. Before my husband died. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. My ranch has plenty of room, he said, his voice carrying a weight of understanding. Good food, warm beds. Safety. This winter is no place for a child without proper shelter. Mai Lin's heart began to race with a familiar fear. She had heard stories of men who preyed on desperate women. What would you want in return? She asked quietly, pulling Mai closer. The question seemed to surprise him. He turned to look at her fully, and she saw a deep, soul-crushing pain in his eyes that mirrored her own. I once had a family, Mrs. Lin. A wife and a little girl, about Mai's age. His voice grew thick with an emotion he fought to control. They were lost in a blizzard 2 years ago. I couldn't save them when they needed me most. He looked at the pale child in her arms. Maybe I can help save her. The raw honesty in his words disarmed her. This wasn't predation, it was a man trying to heal his own broken heart. Your daughter is fading, Mrs. Lin, he said, his tone becoming more decisive. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon if nothing changes. My ranch can change that. Just then, Mai stirred, and for the first time in days, she opened her eyes. They were weak, but they were open. Everything logical told Mai Lin to be afraid. But as she looked at her daughter's face, seeing the first spark of life she'd witnessed in days, she knew the greatest danger wasn't trusting this stranger. The greatest danger was doing nothing at all. As they sat in the wagon, surrounded by more food than she had seen in months, Mai Lin felt something she hadn't dared to feel since the mine collapsed and took her husband. She felt a fragile, but unmistakably real, sense of hope. The decision came easier than she expected. Yes, she whispered to Arthur Corrigan. We'll come with you. He simply nodded and clicked his tongue to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them away from the town and into the vast, snow-covered country. The journey was made in a comfortable silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, My Lin saw a landscape that was both beautiful and unforgiving. Rolling hills covered in a thick blanket of white stretched as far as the eye could see, and distant snow-capped peaks touched the winter sky. And Mai dozed against her chest, the milk having worked a small miracle, bringing a faint touch of color back to her tiny body. After nearly 2 hours, Arthur pointed ahead to a valley nestled between two hills. "Home," he said simply. The ranch house was not the rough cabin Mai Lin had expected, but a proper 2-story home with a wraparound porch, smoke curling from its chimney like a welcome signal. Yet, as they drew closer, she noticed details that spoke of a deep and lingering sadness. In the front yard, nearly buried in a snowdrift, sat a small wooden swing, its ropes frayed. On the porch stood a child's rocking horse, its paint peeling, waiting for a rider who would never return. "I couldn't bring myself to put them away," Arthur said quietly, his jaw tight. "Clara, my wife, she always said a house should look lived in." He helped her down from the wagon with that same careful gentleness and led her inside. The house was clean and well-maintained, but it felt frozen in time. In the kitchen, a small table was set for 3, the plates covered in a thin layer of dust. On a shelf, children's books were stacked neatly. Above the fireplace, a family portrait made Mai Lin's heart ache. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile held a little girl who looked to be about 5. She had her father's grey eyes and her mother's smile. Behind them stood Arthur, his face filled with a happiness that was now completely gone. "Clara and Lily," he said softly, his voice heavy with a guilt that time had not eased. Mai Lin shifted and Mai in her arms. "I'm sorry," she said. There were no words for that kind of pain, but she understood the sudden, devastating loss of a world. That evening, Arthur prepared a simple meal of stew and fresh bread. And Mai managed to eat a few spoonfuls of broth and, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "It's good, Mama," she whispered, her voice bringing tears to Mai Lin's eyes. Later, as Mai dozed by the fire, Arthur sat down with a piece of wood and a small knife. His massive, calloused fingers worked with surprising delicacy, and slowly, the shape of a doll began to emerge. "Every little girl should have a doll," he said simply, his gaze softening as he looked at her sleeping daughter. Mai Lin watched this complicated, grieving man who had opened his home to them, asking for nothing in return. She realized with a jolt that made her pulse quicken that this wasn't just about saving Mai anymore. Somehow, in the space of a single day, Arthur Corrigan had begun to save her, too. Just as a fragile peace settled over them, the sound of approaching horses shattered the quiet winter night. Through the window, Mai Lin saw torches bobbing in the darkness, moving steadily toward the house. "Stay here," Arthur said grimly, his body tensing. As the riders drew closer, angry voices carried on the wind, and she realized with a growing dread that their sanctuary was about to be invaded. Sheriff Brody led the grim-faced group, which included Mrs. Gable and several other women from the town's church committee. Their faces were set with the righteous certainty of people convinced they were doing God's work. Arthur stepped onto the porch, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Evening, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What brings you out on a night like this?" The sheriff dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Arthur, there's been talk. Folks are concerned about the child's welfare, living here with you." "It's a scandal," Mrs. Gable declared, her voice sharp with moral outrage. "An unmarried woman, a foreigner, living under your roof. What kind of example is that?" "The kind that saves a child's life," Arthur replied evenly. "And Mai was starving while your community turned its back on her. Should I apologize for offering them shelter from a blizzard?" One of the other women stepped forward, holding a folder. "We have legal papers, signed by the judge. This situation is morally inappropriate. We have the authority to remove the child to a proper Christian home." The blood drained from Mai Lin's face. "No," she whispered, clutching Mai, who had woken and begun to cry softly. "You can't take her. She's my daughter. Let them talk. Arthur's voice dropped to a dangerous growl as he took a step forward. While they're talking, Unmai is eating, sleeping in a warm bed, and getting stronger every day. Which matters more, their gossip or her life? Mrs. Gable's eyes flashed. Don't you dare lecture us on morality, Arthur Corrigan. We all know what happened to your first family. Maybe if you'd been a better husband and father, they'd still be alive. The word struck Arthur like a physical blow. The cruel accusation that he was responsible for Clara and Lily's deaths was the one weapon that could pierce his armor. He staggered, the old guilt washing over his features. Seeing his pain, a protective fury rose in Mai Lin. How dare you, she said, her voice shaking with rage. This man is the kindest, most decent person I have ever met. He saved my daughter when your community left us to die in the snow. If anyone should be ashamed, it is all of you. But the damage was done. Arthur had withdrawn into himself, and Mai Lin could see him beginning to doubt if his actions were causing more harm than good. Unmai, sensing the shift, tugged on his coat. Big man, she said softly, using the name she'd given him. Don't let them take me away. I like it here. You make Mama smile again. Her innocent words seemed to steady him. He looked down at Unmai, and some of his strength returned. Tell me, Sheriff, he said quietly. What's more important? Following your rules or keeping a family together? Seeing him waver, Mai Lin felt a crushing despair. She couldn't ask him to sacrifice his reputation for them. Maybe they're right, she began, her voice barely audible. Maybe we should go. Mai Lin, no. Arthur's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic. I won't survive out there. But I can't destroy your life, she replied, tears streaming down her face. Unmai began crying harder, clinging to Arthur's leg. No, Mama, please. Big man, don't let them take us. Her desperate plea seemed to break something in Arthur. He knelt, his weathered hands gentle as he wiped her tears. Then he stood, his full height towering over everyone. When he spoke, his voice carried across the night with the authority of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Sheriff, he said clearly, I appreciate your concern. But I have something to tell you, and the entire town. He paused, looking directly at Mai Lin with a fierce determination she had never seen before. He took her hand in his massive, gentle grip. Mai Lin isn't my charity case. She's going to be my wife. The words hung in the frigid night air, silencing the whispers and shocked gasps. Ethan, Mai Lin whispered, searching his face in the flickering torchlight, what are you doing? I need to talk to you, he said, his voice meant only for her. He turned to the stunned crowd. Give us a few minutes. He guided her inside, Unmai still clinging to his hand. Once the door was closed, he turned to her, his own hands shaking slightly as he cupped her face. Mai Lin, look at me. She raised her eyes to his, and what she saw there wasn't pity or obligation. It was love, pure and simple, shining in his eyes like a hearth fire on the coldest night. I'm not proposing to save you from them, he said quietly, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I'm proposing because in the last few days, you and Unmai have brought life back into this house, and back into me. I was just existing before. Now, I'm living again. I love you, Mai Lin. From her chair, Unmai's sleepy voice piped up. Mama, big man makes you happy. You sing when you cook now. Mai Lin looked at her daughter, safe and warm, and then back at the gentle giant who had offered them everything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a simple gold band. This was my mother's ring, he said softly. I've been carrying it for 3 days, trying to find the courage to ask. Not because the town demanded it, but because I can't imagine my life without you and Unmai in it. Right there in his living room, with the townspeople still murmuring outside, Arthur Corrigan dropped to one knee. Mai Lin, will you marry me? Will you help me turn this house back into a home? She thought of her first husband, gone too soon, and felt his blessing in her heart. He would want this for them. He would want Unmai to have a father. Yes, she whispered, her voice strong. Yes, Arthur Corrigan. I'll marry you. He slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her gently as I clapped her small hands. But just as their future seemed secure, the sound of a lone rider approaching at a gallop shattered their peace. A man dismounted with an air of arrogant authority. It was Junwei, her late husband's brother, a man she had hoped never to see again. My Lin! Junwei called out, striding toward the porch and waving legal papers in his fist. I've come for the girl. As her blood relative, I have the legal right to raise her properly, not in some scandalous arrangement. My Lin stepped forward, no longer the desperate woman from the general store. Junwei, she is my daughter. She stays with me. Does she? He sneered. A woman living in sin? The law is on my side. His cold gaze fell on Mai, who pressed herself against Arthur's leg. Big man, she whispered, I don't want to go with him. Mai looked up at Arthur with wide, fearful eyes, then declared in her small, clear voice, I want to stay with Mama and Papa Arthur. Her words, and the name she had chosen for him, carried across the yard. Even Mrs. Gable shifted uncomfortably. Arthur stepped forward, his massive frame a protective shield. The child has made her choice, he said quietly. She's happy, healthy, and loved. That makes us her family in every way that matters. Sheriff Brody finally intervened. Thomas, I've seen enough tonight. That little girl has been through hell. Look at her now. Sometimes the law needs to consider what's truly best for a child. Surprisingly, Mrs. Gable spoke up. He's right. I saw that child starving while you were nowhere to be found. Where were you when she needed family? Junwei's confidence faltered as he realized the crowd was no longer on his side. He saw the ring on My Lin's finger and the unshakable unity of the three people on the porch. He had lost. Crumpling the documents in his fist, he muttered a hollow threat and rode away in defeat. As the townspeople dispersed, some now offering quiet congratulations, Arthur and My Lin stood on their porch with Mai held securely between them. Their little family was finally safe. 3 months later, the spring thaw had begun to melt the snow. My Lin stood at the kitchen window, her hand resting on her gently swelling belly, and watched Arthur teach Mai to ride a small pony. Her daughter's laughter, pure and joyful, rang across the meadow. The woman who had once counted 7 cents with shaking hands now counted blessings that were infinite, knowing that their story had found its perfect beginning. They were home.